Topic 9, Macroeconomic Policy 3. And this topic is about quantitative easing and quantitative tightening. So the first thing to note is that quantitative easing is only used during recession. So there's really no role for quantitative easing during boom periods. So what we've got here in this diagram is an economy at point A in a recession. Now, what we've learned so far is that in response to that recession, the central bank will tend to lower the cash rate. And at the same time, if the recession is severe enough, the government may start increasing government spending and cutting taxes. So both monetary policy and fiscal policy would be in operation to try to move the aggregate demand curve to the right, to move the economy from point A towards point C. But sometimes, and I'm thinking just after the global financial crisis and just after the COVID recession in 2020, sometimes monetary policy and fiscal policy alone are inadequate to move the economy back to full employment, that is back to point C. Now, that could be a result of a number of different reasons. For example, we could have consumer and business expectations at very low levels. We could have consumer debt at very high levels when the economy is in a recession at point A, which really restricts the ability of consumers to, in response to the recession and the expansionary monetary policy and fiscal policy, it restricts consumers' ability to then borrow additional money or take the tax cuts and spend. In such a situation with high consumer debt levels, I'm thinking personal loans, mortgage debt, that sort of thing, consumers may well be more inclined to pay down their debt rather than borrow even more money and or spend their tax cuts. But it could be for a range of other reasons as well. It could be a result of stock market weakness, house prices falling, a range of other reasons for which monetary policy and fiscal policy are just inadequate to move the aggregate demand curve to AD1. So in that case, what we've seen in recent decades is central banks using something called quantitative easing. And the whole point of quantitative easing is to shift the demand curve to the right during recessions. Quantitative easing really doesn't have any impact on the aggregate supply curve. So it's all about shifting that AD curve to the right. I guess the final thing to consider then is, why is quantitative easing used only after monetary policy and fiscal policy have been tried? And so I've given you a bit of time to think about that. The answer really comes down to the risks involved with the introduction and use of quantitative easing. So there are risks in terms of inflation and asset price bubbles, which really don't exist to the same extent when monetary policy and fiscal policy are used. In terms of quantitative easing, it's also quite difficult, quite time-consuming to implement the policy, and then unwinding the policy in the process called quantitative tightening can be quite problematic, as we'll see. So in terms of the speed in which QE can be implemented, ask yourself this question: how long does it take the central bank to reduce the cash rate? If it wanted to reduce the cash rate by 2%, how long would that take? The answer is, it could be done overnight. It could be done the next day. But if you wanted to reduce long-term interest rates by the same 2%, how long would that take? Well, to do that, you would have to launch a massive bond buying program. And that can't be done in 24 hours. That's going to take months and months and months to organise. The other thing to think about in terms of the problems associated with using quantitative easing relative to, say, more conventional monetary policy is the precision with which interest rates can be adjusted under those two options. So I'm ignoring fiscal policy for now. If you want to cut short-term interest rates by 2% using conventional monetary policy, it's very easy to cut them by exactly 2%. If you want to reduce long-term rates under QE by 2%, start thinking about the difficulty in moving those long-term interest rates down by exactly 2%. Think about it in terms of the demand and supply of loanable funds. What's happening under QE? Demand and supply of loanable funds. We've got the interest rate on the vertical axis. What's happening under QE is the supply curve of loanable funds is shifting out to the right when the central bank implements quantitative easing. The problem is, or the big question is, how far do you need to shift that supply curve out to the right? That is, how much money do you need to inject into bond markets through this bond buying program to reduce interest rates by exactly 2%? Well, no one's got that answer. It depends upon, if you just think about the diagram, it depends upon the slope of the demand for loanable funds curve. Because we're dealing with a competitive market for money here, and trying to drive interest rates down by 2% is going to be very, very difficult. Now, it's not going to be difficult. What I mean is it's going to be difficult in terms of reducing them by precisely 2%. That is just going to take time. So the way I would do it is an approach where I implement QE, and it's a step-by-step approach. I buy some bonds, look what impact that has on interest rates, long-term rates. Then I buy a little bit more. Then step back, what impacts that had on interest rates. So it would be this gradual process of injecting more and more QE money into the economy to start pushing these long rates down. And so that alone should help you understand that QE is fairly imprecise in terms of interest rate control, and it's going to be quite time consuming compared to conventional monetary policy to actually implement. But nevertheless, central banks around the world and governments have supported this, the use of QE. They've found it necessary to implement QE when monetary policy and fiscal policy are just insufficient to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right to restore full employment.